Xenoblade Definitive Edition ended up not really giving us a whole lot of new material to work with, although some of what is there is really interesting, but one thing it did give us that I'm not sure too many people were expecting is the amazing 10th anniversary art for the entire series, and with it, what is surprisingly the first generic logo for all of Xenoblade that we've ever seen. That may seem hard to believe, but if you really think about it, have you ever had something other than the Xenoblade 1 logo that you could use to represent the entire series? No, not at all. The X and 2 logos are clearly taking their own spin on the 1 logo, but now that we have this generic logo, we can now say the 1 logo is actually taking a spin on that, and analyze all of them to see what specific things about the game are being highlighted in the design choices of the logo. So basically, I'm just gonna go through the logos from 1, X, and 2, and talk about them, and talk about how they differ from the generic logo seen on the 10th anniversary art, and why those differences are put in. I'm going to be using the version of the logo that appears on the box of the game, so that's going to be the one with the gray text, because while all 3 logos have been rendered in black text previously, that was mostly for like supplemental things, where, alright, we need to put the logo on a light colored background, gray kind of blends in, so we're just gonna darken it, make it black. There. The gray is the more iconic stuff, it's the stuff that shows up on most official material and on the game boxes themselves, so I think it's fair to use that. Although, really, all the grays are the same and all the blacks are the same, so it doesn't really matter, but I'm just going to go with a more iconic thing. I'm going to start with the generic logo before going into any of the games, and it is worth noting that one version of the 10th anniversary art, the one that appears on the top of the page for the 10th anniversary on Monolith Soft's website, does use the gray version of the Japanese Xenoblade 1 logo, so where it's just Xenoblade written out, and then it says Xenoblade again in katakana below it instead of the word Chronicles. Chronicles was only added in the English localization of Xenoblade 1, so all future Xenoblade games also have Chronicles. I'm going to be looking at the versions of the logo that have the Chronicles in it, but the word Chronicles is rendered in the same way as the word Xenoblade is for every logo, so it doesn't really matter. The Japanese version just doesn't say Chronicles, and might sometimes say Xenoblade underneath it too. So, yeah, they do use the Xenoblade 1 logo here, so technically you could argue that that is the real logo for the entire series, but then the wallpaper you can download, both the mobile and the desktop versions, does in fact have this gold, unmodified Helvetica logo. And yeah, I've been kind of beating around the bush. Like, the generic logo, it's a slightly modified Helvetica black where the letters are tilted, but not as much as the italic, and each individual letter has been moved, the space between them is decreased, so they're all touching each other in a way where it looks nice, it pops out. I can see any of the Xenoblade logos, the generic one, the 1-1, the X1, or the 2-1, and be like, yeah, that's a Xenoblade logo, but like, it's Helvetica. It's a very popular font. If there was a third skeleton in Undertale, it would be named after Helvetica. There isn't really anything that makes the series unique or special conveyed in the logo, because it's just kind of a common font that's been modified in a specific way. And yeah, the gold coloring, I'm pretty sure it's just to make it look nice against the purple backdrop and to evoke the Zohar color, because you could see the shape of that in the background of both versions of the artwork where the generic logo is used. It's actually cropped so that you can't see it in the version where the Xenoblade 1 logo is used, so I'd wager that if they were to use this generic logo as the series logo, at some point it would be either gray or black if it was used in a context other than this huge grandiose celebration of a decade of the series context. So yeah, the generic logo, there really isn't a whole lot special about it. Like, the Monado Beginning of the World logo, that used its own font. The final Xenoblade 1 logo, yeah, that modifies the Helvetica, but it's still just Helvetica. Xenogears and Xenosaga, they did at least make up their own fonts for their logos, so that's kind of a disappointing part about how the series is presented, where it's just kind of a generic font, which is weird because they went from a unique font to a generic one when they went from Monado Beginning of the World to Xenoblade, aka when they went from generic JRPG to Xenogame. So I don't really know. I mean, it's a really minor thing, all things considered, and the logos themselves aesthetically look really nice when they're modified from just kind of italic Helvetica black, but smooshed. So there isn't really much to complain about, it's just an observation. So now we can move on to Xenoblade 1, and by that I mean Xenoblade Chronicles, the Wii game, because yeah, 3D modified the logo by adding a 3D, but Definitive Edition actually changed up the Western version of the logo a little bit, and I'm obviously going to comment on the whole Definitive Edition part of the logo where they add new stuff for Definitive Edition. What makes this different than the generic logo? Well, besides the color, there's obviously this texture over it that makes it look a bit uneven and stuff, and then there's all the paint splotches, where also it just straight up looks like one part of the X was just done in a brush stroke from lower left to upper right. So what does this represent about the game? Well, it's a little less obvious than later logos, including the editions made in Definitive Edition, but this just straight up is representative of the Monado, the Xenoblade, itself. Each Monado art is represented by a Chinese character, which serves as the symbol for the art on your arts palette, as well as the thing that shows up in the middle of the art ring when Shulk uses it. And Chinese calligraphy, or writing Chinese characters with a brush and ink and making it all deliberate and look nice and following the proper brush strokes and the proper order of doing everything in a very deliberate way to make it look all nice and stuff, that is just straight up its own art form. So this logo is basically the Xenoblade logo as written by the same person who wrote the Monado art. And this is even backed up in the intro of Definitive Edition, where the red X, which it looks like the beta Xenoblade XX, it looks most like the X in the Xenoblade 1 logo, but I'm gonna call it the Xenogears X because it's really the Xenogears X. That's actually written into brushstrokes with brushstroke sound effects before it flashes into the full DE logo. Now, you might be thinking, alright, if there's texture on the text to make it look a bit uneven, there's all these paint splotches, there's a bunch of streaking in the one stroke on the X, did this person really do a particularly good job with their calligraphy? Well, considering they used an art form that's designed to represent Chinese characters as artfully as possible, and did it to do 2 entire words in the case of the Western logo in the Latin alphabet, I'm gonna give them some slack. Because I can clearly read that it says Xenoblade Chronicles and it looks like Helvetica, so I think you did a pretty good job, fake person who allegedly wrote this logo out with a brush and ink. As for DE, the Western version of the logo actually needed to change things up a little bit, and by that I mean they had to move the Chronicles word down and to the left a little bit, so everything, including the Definitive Edition part, could be centered. As for the new DE part, the words Definitive Edition are there, there's a bit of a gradient on it, but it's mostly red in the same reds as the Monado and as the 2 in the Xenoblade 2 logo, and that's in a different Helvetica. I think that might actually just be regular bold Helvetica as opposed to the custom tilted and kerned Helvetica black used in the main logo, but it's the same font family, so it's super consistent, and that is paired with a bunch of glowing feathers which go around the DE words as well as behind the Chronicles a little bit too, and those are pretty straightforward. Future Connected is Melia's story, so it's High-Entia feathers. Yeah. Moving on to X, we actually have to talk about the original logo for X. Remember how it was first just revealed as Project X, and the X in that X was just basically a bigger version of the Xenoblade 1 X, which was drawn in with brushstrokes. But then, there's also the preliminary Xenoblade Chronicles X logo, which is actually a lot closer to the final generic Xenoblade logo from the 10th anniversary art than anything else, because it's just Xenoblade Chronicles written in unmodified Helvetica beyond the custom kerning and tilting like I said before, and the X is just the X from Project X instead of the final Xenoblade XX. XXXXXXXXXXX. I think I said sex at least twice in there, shut up. So that's just interesting. I guess they didn't really know exactly what place Xenoblade X was going to have in the series, even though they very clearly nailed down the tone, and it's kind of weird that they were using brushstrokes for what was clearly a more sci-fi story than the steampunky fantasy Xenoblade 1, but I just thought that's a bit of interesting series history, and now we can move on to the real X logo, which is all nice and stuff, and has its own deal. First, I'm going to talk about the X where, alright, Xenoblade 1's special color was the Monado red, big deal. Xenoblade X's special color is this light blue, turquoisey, blue-greeny thing. Don't really know how to describe it, but this is actually a different blue than basically any other blue in the Xeno series we'd seen up until now. Like, the Monado blue was less green than this and was a bit darker. Cosmos used a completely different blue, and even her light-up bits weren't like this. So this is a completely unique color that's specifically supposed to represent X, and the way the X is, it has the horizontal lines in it and all that stuff, and it's a very sci-fi looking color. You can tell that this is a sci-fi game just by looking at this logo. And then there's also the fact that this is, I believe, the default exhaust logo for Skells, so this also actually represents the Skells as well. And the fact that there's that whole separate vertical line, it gives a nice sense of motion up and to the right, which helps that all the holes through the actual word Xenoblade Chronicles have that too, but that also gives the sense of taking off, because, well, it's about flying. You get the flight module at some point, and it's humanity going into space, and I think I've actually seen some really cool, I'm not going to show them here because I think it's like on fan merch that you can buy, fan rendering of this X where it's actually the exhaust of a Skell that's flying up and to the right, so that's all nice and cool. But then as for the Xenoblade Chronicles itself, the texture is a bit different looking than in Xenoblade 1, so it looks a bit less like ink or paint and more like scratched up metal, and then there's also holes in it and a bunch of little bits flying out. It's basically the I need a bigger gun of Xenoblade logos, because it basically looks like this logo has been shot up by bullets and pieces are shattering and coming out of it. It could also technically be skells flying through it, and it could also be glass as opposed to metal, especially because of the shattering and stuff. I think glass makes a bit more sense in terms of the being shot up and looking like that, but in terms of texture, it does look a lot more like metal, and again, gray and black aren't exactly glass colors. But again, that's basically just to represent war. Xenoblade 1 has war in it, but Xenoblade X is basically entirely about war. Its effect on other people and trying to build a world and build a place where people can be safe despite a war that's going on. And then also, yeah, there are guns in this one, more than just Sharla. Like, there are actual guns that shoot actual bullets and not, I'm going to shoot you and you're going to feel better. So it makes sense for the logo to have bullet holes in it. It also, again, belays the more gritty sci-fi take on a Xeno world, as opposed to Xenoblade 1, which is again mostly fantasy-based. And lastly, the position of the word Chronicles is changed again when compared to Xenoblade 1 and DE in the Western logo. It's moved a bit down from where it was in the original 1 logo, i.e. the H, I, and L aren't directly touching the word Xenoblade, although the H and the B do have one bullet hole going through both of them. And it's moved to the right of where it is in both of them, so the C is underneath the N, as opposed to being directly underneath the crosspoint of the X in the Definitive Edition logo, or touching the lower right corner of the X in the original logo. And for Xenoblade 2, there are plenty of obvious differences we can talk about, but the first thing on the agenda is going to be talking about how the Western version of the logo moved the position of Chronicles again. Wahoo! In terms of vertical positioning, it stays about the same distance below Xenoblade as it did for X and will do so in DE, but its left and right position is different from both of them. This time, the vertical strokes of the N in Xenoblade and H in Chronicles are aligned, as opposed to it just kind of being arbitrarily positioned in the other versions. So, I mean, it looks nice, but really what this was done was to better accommodate the two and make it fit in better and look good with everything else. So, yeah. Now, again, I talked about how I'm using the gray version of the logo, and gray might actually be a misnomer in this case, because if you look at it closely, the letters are actually white. They're just on fire, and being charred has turned them gray and almost black in some cases, because that's what fire does. Obviously, this fire is a reference to both Pyra and the tragedy the Aegis caused 500 years ago, so this is heavy thematic implications, and it even ties into a specific line that said, "I won't let the world burn a second time." So this logo is actually representative of both what happened 500 years ago and the tragedy Rex and Co. are trying to avert in the present day. As for the 2 itself, it's not really Pyra-colored, it's mostly Monado-colored, even throughout the entire gradient. It gets about the same color as her hair in places, but that's about it, although it is clearly representative of the Aegis, because it does have, on the top part in a darker section, the little X with the pointy stroke thing on it that both Pyra and Mithra have. Torna the Golden Country, well, I guess since Xenoblade 2 is already pretty well centered, didn't need to move the word Chronicles again, but it also added its own little subtitle looking thing, and this isn't super representative of anything. It just kind of looks like a royal seal or something, or even if that was just the title section of the cover of a fantasy novel, I think that would look really nice. It's got the emblem of the Kingdom of Torna on the left, like an official looking seal, and then it's just got a gold thing, another gold gradient, so it looks like light is shining off of it. I don't know exactly which font this is, although I made an edit of it at some point, I think for One Piece, so I know I found it in the past, and it just looks neat, but it isn't something super representative of anything other than, yeah, Torna sure was a nice kingdom, and oh no, you see the fire in the Xenoblade Chronicles above it? Yeah, that might happen in the DLC. But yeah, that is me overanalyzing the logos of the Xenoblade games, and now that we sort of know exactly how they're representing certain things in these logos, you know that when we get a new Xenoblade game, I'm going to overanalyze the logo and see if that gives any hints about the story. But yeah, until next time when I make an actual scripted Luxon video, This is Said Luxon signing off.